In another PhD study of Alison Montagrin, we try to test this idea that even stimuli that are totally neutral can be better remembered if we make the stimuli become relevant for the individuals in one way or another. So we did several experiments. A recent version of this is the following. You see just faces. So imagine the study would be like I would take a picture of each of you and just show the picture on the computer screen and then ask a participant what faces he or she remembers and what faces he or she does not remember, okay? But for each face, what we did was to create a situation that was relevant or not for the participant, okay? With respect to the goals of the participants, all right? And then we ask participants in a memory task whether or not he remembers the faces. And we find an effect of goal relevance, or what we call goal conduciveness, so stimuli that are particularly conducive for your goals, that helps your goals, are better remembered. Those that goes against your goals are also better remembered. And interestingly, we use neutral faces, so the faces themselves were not particularly emotional. So why this kind of research, okay, keeping with a cognitive approach and the kind of complex models that we discussed at the beginning, not going back to behaviorism as such, can be still useful, I think, to better understand emotion and emotional memory. So the general idea that we all have, which is true, is that we have encoding, that's what we discussed earlier, then consolidation, and during encoding, there is, of course, room for flexibility, and the memory trace can be changed, of course. This is the definition of encoding, okay? Depending on what you hear from me now, it will create different memories. But then, as we just discussed, when you will go back home and sleep on it, you will consolidate the information, and now it becomes a stable memory. And at retrieval, the general tendency a few years ago, at least, was to think that it's, again, something stable. Do you remember this movie? Maybe. Then the question is, can we change or even erase a memory using different techniques? And there is this notion that if at some point you again activate a memory, then it becomes, again, relatively easy to be changed. So it's labile. I don't know how you say it in English. Labile, yes, good. Labile, okay, thanks. And then it's stable again, okay? And then you have a trouble. And this window, of course, could be of high interest for psychotherapy, okay? Also, this framework is based mainly on conditioning research. If you are interested in this, the best recent review article that appeared recently, I guess that you can find, is this one, published in TICS, Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where they review the state of the art on memory reconsolidation. So this is a very general idea. Imagine someone is encountering a dog, and one could expect that he feels fear, okay? So let's imagine he created a fear memory of the situation, okay? Then, when he would see only the collar here, le collier, it would remind him of the situation, and it would elicit what has been associated with this collar. And for instance, he could be again afraid because he remembers the emotional situation. Also, there is no dog anymore, of course, but there is a cue that was associated. And then fear would be again activated just because he perceives the cue that was associated. So far, so good, nothing new, okay? But then what happens when there is a reminder? Then there are many interventions that you can think of. For instance, you could use what is typically used, extinction. So you show only the collar many times, meaning that you create a safe context. So some researchers talk about safety trials in a way, because now there is no more risk, okay? It's not associated anymore with something dangerous. So it's under extinction. You could do some counter conditioning. So each time that you show it, you give some money, for instance. So you try to associate now a positive emotional memory to the stimulus. So using opposite emotions, so to speak. Or what has been done a few times, you could try to fight against consolidation using interference. So you use tasks that are very demanding in terms of attentional resources, so that people will have more difficulties to consolidate their memory. And using such approaches, one claim is that when the person will again encounter the collar, he will still remember the situation, okay? But without the fear being associated. So it may not change what he remembers, but it would be less associated with the fear. Maybe one example of this, which is a paper published a few years ago already, which was a quite important paper in Science, in humans. So most of this work has been done with animals, of course, but some studies use the translational approach, trying to move beyond laboratory research in animals. And what they wanted to test is whether basically this can work in humans using similar paradigms than the ones I showed you before. Okay? So what they did basically is first fear conditioning. Okay? So they created implicit emotional memories that relate to fear during the first day. So you would come to the lab, you would see a neutral picture like the one I showed you, like a color square, and then receive, for instance, an electric shock. Okay, this is day one. And then this is the critical aspect of this literature on reconsolidation. The next day, you would reactivate the memory. For instance, you would just show again, okay, the conditioned stimulus. And you would wait either 6 hours or 10 minutes. Why? Because from animal research and earlier human research, this is a period that is supposed to be the period during which the memory is liable, okay? The 10 minutes. If you wait too long, then it's already reconsolidated, if you wish. There is earlier work suggesting this, and they replicated it here, because for the group for which you wait 6 hours, they still have the same fear conditioning, okay? But for the group for which you do extinction only after 10 minutes, so during the sensitive window, if you wish, then there is a disappearance of the emotional reaction, or at least there is significantly less emotional reaction. How do they show it? So they show it in fMRI, for instance. So here you have the amygdala reaction to the previously neutral stimulus, okay? If you compare the groups with the extinction 6 hours later, as compared to the group who had the extinction 10 minutes later. Meaning that there is a significantly stronger activation of the amygdala for the group that received the extinction 6 hours later than for the group that received extinction only 10 minutes after. And the only place where you could have this interference is because it was a window of reconsolidation. And it seems to work even on day 5 when they come back. And if you do the measures that I showed you before in terms of electrodermal response, okay, skin conductance reaction, then what you find is that the group that had the extinction 6 hours later still show the skin conductance reaction towards the neutral stimulus here, but not the group who had the extinction 10 minutes after. Okay? Is it relatively clear? Yes, thank you. But of course, Leslie is probably the person who can talk more about how this could be used in psychotherapy.
Now, we started a discussion over lunch, which is, so we have need, concern, goal, relevance, right? And you separate motivation from emotion. And if we take the standard definition of appraisal of a situation in relation to a need, goal, or concern is what generates emotion, the big issue for me for 25 years or 30 years has been what is need, right? And I am trying to develop a consistent emotion theory for therapy. I'm arguing that actually what we come into the world with is a basic psychoaffective motor emotion system. And we don't actually come into the world with needs. We come into the world with some drives, but not with needs. So we aren't actually born with an attachment need. What we're born with is an emotion system that functions for our survival, and that then when we get comfort, we like it. So therefore we want it, right? So it actually makes motivation, you know, and we began this discussion, but not fully. I wouldn't say secondary as a less fundamental phenomena, but we are designed through our emotion system to have certain needs, rather than that we're born with certain. I think conditioning is the most primitive form of human learning, and that there are at least 3 levels: conditioning, schematic, and conceptual. And that to try to, I mean, the conditioning paradigm is valid, but it's not ecologically valid for complex human beings in therapy. But it's being used that way, and I will discuss it a little in my talk, that then exposure becomes the view through the lens of a conditioning model. And I don't think that's what actually occurs, that people are much more complex than stimulus response. Now, as I mentioned to you at lunch, you know, I was an engineer, I came into psychology, I was not schooled or propagandized into a learning theory way of thinking of human functioning. And I see there's a kind of a need to have more coherence. If people are goal-directed organisms, they're also not just conditioned, right? So this goal-directed, and that's what I like about the whole emotion base, you know, it's in relation to a goal. It's my goals, not the stimuli, that motivate me. So therefore, the explanation of more complex behavior, I'm not challenging, you know, but it's sort of like the meta-communicative message is we need to understand people as conditioning, associationistic learning rats. We are in part, but that's at our most primitive level, and we have other ways of functioning that become involved in who we are and in how psychopathology or disorder emerges. And the problem is it's being explained through conditioning and therefore extinction. I don't think that's what actually goes on.
I mean, I'm sorry to say that I think we agree, because the reason why I also started with goal relevance and with the very example that emotions are not stimulus-response
right,
reactions.
You did say that, and I was so thrilled.
Exactly,
too,
yes,
right?
absolutely. But as you said just 1 minute ago, it doesn't mean that there are not also such primitive mechanisms that are at play.
I agree.
And then maybe we could still use these, maybe in some clinical conditions. I don't know, maybe when you treat PTSD, for instance, it would more make sense to use this than for the type of examples that you described at the beginning. But maybe it can be, you know, a tool in the toolcase, I don't know, that you could use in some cases. But that would be a big, big mistake, I think, to use only this approach in therapy for sure. So I don't want the take-home message to be that we should go back to behaviorism. And honestly, during my own career, I had the same perceptions as the one you described. So this is like behaviorism that is not useful when you have a cognitive approach, for instance. But given that these findings seems to be relatively strong and replicable, why don't we try to integrate them in a more complex view of human beings, and maybe in some cases they can be useful. But we should not be too reductionist.
Right. Emotion can be being processed productively, or it can be being processed unproductively. Adaptive emotions are usually processed productively. It's not only that I have the emotion, it's that my relationship to the emotion and how I process it, how I use it. Emotion gives me information, it gives me action tendency, and usually with my adaptive emotions, I use them effectively. With maladaptive emotions, I can process, so I feel core shame, or I feel core fear, this painful, which is really a function of emotional learning, emotional memory, emotional experience. In therapy, I can either process it productively or unproductively. So it's really how my relationship to my emotion and what I'm doing with it. So we've developed a measure of productive emotional processing, and it's most relevant to how we deal with maladaptive emotion. So not all emotion is processed productively in therapy, even though it's aroused. We want to get to painful emotions, but we want to process them productively. So productive processing, the scale we've developed, we call it being contactfully or mindfully aware of your emotion. And it has different characteristics. To process an emotion productively, therapeutically productively, you need to attend to it, firstly. You could be feeling something and not put any attention to it. You need to allow the emotion, that's the expressive part. You need to symbolize the emotion. So we need to bring cognition usually. We usually symbolize in language, although you could symbolize in art and movement. The emotional symbolization and expression needs to be congruent with the actual feeling. We need to accept the emotion, and this is very important. People can have emotion, it can be aroused, but they don't accept it. This is bad, this is going to kill me, this is going to lead me to kill you. Then you have a fear of emotion, which leads to the avoidance or protection of it. You need to feel like you're an agent of the emotion rather than a victim of emotion. I am having the emotion rather than the emotion is having me. You need to be able to have the emotion within a regulated range, within a window of tolerance. Emotion can be overwhelming, so to be productively processed, you have to feel like you're an agent of the emotion, you have to accept the emotion has to be sufficiently regulated. And finally, and most complex, the emotion needs to be being differentiated. As you are working with it in therapy, it needs to be transforming in some way into finer parts, into other meanings, into other emotions, and so on. So what we have then is a measure, this is just a pictorial representation of it. And so then what we've shown is that it's not only having emotion that and deeply experiencing it, as we showed in the previous research program, but that there are processes and sequences of emotion that are important. So the scheme is a pattern of mental organization. It provides implicit higher order organization. And it's different from a cognitive schema. The notion of scheme came from Piaget. A scheme is an action and experiencing producing structure. When the scheme is activated, I feel something and my body has a tendency to do something. A schema is a belief in language. It comes from Bartlett. It's like, I think I am worthless. When I grew up as a psychotherapist in the 1970s, we talked about, I feel worthless. Suddenly in the 90s, it became, I believe I'm worthless. What really is it, right? Well, I'm saying really, it's a complex blend of those, but it's based in a bodily experience. And we can talk about things, but that's not the same as experiencing things. So we have this complex network of an emotion scheme or emotion schematic memory. It represents internally our emotional reactions, our lived emotional reactions of the past, plus the evoking stimulus situation, the meaning of the situation. Later we introduce more concept, language, belief, but our children have reactions, emotional reactions, long before they have language, right? They have narrative meaning long before they have language. So what are the mechanisms of change? From an EFT perspective, firstly, there's the relationship. The relationship with the therapist is curative in and of itself. And that's because it provides an emotional environment that is counter to the emotional experience of the difficulties that people are talking about. So we're going to internalize the soothing of the therapist. The therapist is going to help break the isolation. There's going to be a co-regulation of affect. So there are lots of things going on in the relationship itself, which essentially is providing a corrective emotional experience. But the relationship also provides an optimal environment to facilitate specific kinds of emotional processing and change. We've demonstrated, and I just want to touch on, so therapeutic presence, the ability to be in the present and attend to what's going on. I like to think about the therapist as having their finger on the emotional pulse of the client moment by moment. Being present means being present in the moment. It means I'm not thinking about what intervention I'm going to do. I'm also not thinking about the taxes that I haven't paid. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm really there, fully present. And this has a lot of, when we look in the eyes of the other, it has an effect on our brain and our brain chemistry. And a whole emotional process is occurring as a function of my degree of presence. And then there's collaboration or the working alliance. This has been demonstrated. We need agreement to work on emotion. And then there's empathic attunement to affect, finger on the emotional pulse. So these are the kind of contextual variables. They lead to a reduction in cortisol, a reduction in stress. If I'm talking to you about a stressful experience, but I'm experiencing the safety and containment of the relationship, I'm having another experience about the experience of the stress. Polyvagal theory has demonstrated that there's this polyvagal nerve, that there's a fundamental face-to-heart connection, right? That the face of the other, the voice of the other, goes directly to regulating my heartbeat, so that the melodic tone, the facial expression, all these are setting up safety or non-safety and influence how I'm regulating my affect. And then I've tried to develop principles of emotional change based on observations in therapy. We need principles of what are we doing with emotion, and a core one is going to be changing emotion with emotion. But firstly, we want to help people access emotion, become aware of emotion, and express emotion. We don't want to do the same thing all the time. Sometimes it's helpful to express, sometimes it's more helpful to be aware. These two processes are not the same. Being aware is, what is it that you're feeling inside? Can you put words on your feeling or focusing? Expression is, can you say it? You speak out loud, you say things. Me saying to you, I love you, is different to me being aware of the feeling that I love you. It's different to me saying to the therapist, I love my partner. These are all different emotional processes. Then there are the modulating principles, which is we want to help people regulate their emotion. They need to be in a window of tolerance. No, too little emotion is not helpful, too much emotion is not helpful. And then there's a standard idea coming out of the psychoanalytic perspective. We would need to reflect on emotion to make sense, narrative sense of them. So Those are sort of processes, but they're not the only processes. The most important processes are the transformative ones. And my hypothesis is that you can't change these high aroused, amygdala-based emotions by reason. They're impenetrable to reason. I can't talk you out of your core insecurities. I can't talk you out of your shame. We have to find other ways of working with this. And from observation and also research, it seems like one emotion can change another emotion, and I'll talk about that more. And then there's the corrective interpersonal emotional experience, which is if I have a new emotional experience in an actual relationship, it's going to help to change an old emotion. So I want to focus on the transforming principles. And this diagram represents for me the notion of changing emotion with emotion. The received view that most people have grown up with is that somehow having an emotion will then lead to having less of the emotion, and that's what change is, right? The zero baseline theory was catharsis. I don't have that up there. Get rid of the emotion and it goes away. Then there were completion theories of emotion, both from the humanistic therapies and from modern emotional processing. Somehow I process the emotion and then it goes away, right? It's an acceptance-based. I accept having the emotion and it goes away. Then there are the currently very popular detachment kind of notions coming from meditational Buddhist traditions, which is I observe the emotion and it will arise and pass away. And then there are the behavioral models. I habituate to it, right? I loved your little picture of 100 collars, right? And then I'll get used to it. Or it'll extinguish, right? We, in slow pieces, reduce it, eventually it will extinguish. I don't think these are the fundamental ways that emotion changes. I think the process is more represented by something like this. We activate one emotion, and I'll just use the simplest type example, core shame. I have an alcoholic, abusive father. I bring up a memory of that father. I have an automatic body-based reaction of shame and fear. It's a withdrawal emotion. I pull away, my body sinks a little bit, and so on. It is true that you can't feel this sort of shame reaction for longer than 20 minutes or something like that. So there will be a decrease in it over time. But how change occurs is that we activate we activate a new emotion within this 10-minute or past the 10-minute window of memory reconsolidation, so that we activate a new emotion to change the old emotion. So at its most primitive level, if I'm in a withdrawal emotion, which is often the case of in therapy, we're working with the painful emotions. They're often emotions to withdraw. I want to run away, shrink into the ground. If I can help you generate empowered anger, which will produce the tendency to thrust forward and protect your boundaries, or to cry out for the lost one, to grieve, to be sad and look for contact comfort, you can't be organized to run away at the same time as you're organized to thrust forward. And so you're going to begin to get a transformational process at a very brain physiological level. And then a basic law of neuroscience was neurons that fire together wire together and continue to fire together. So if you've got a scheme of shame being activated when you imagine your father, but now you activate a scheme of empowered anger or the sadness of the loss of comfort, we're having these neurons firing together and wiring together, and we're getting a synthesis, a truly new, novel emotional experience. So anger might change shame, and we might end up feeling calm. We might end up feeling confident. We might end up feeling sad, something, but it will change. And what's important is that this is a transformation, a dialectical synthesis in which something truly novel generates, right? This comes from a basic Piagetian notion of development. Behaviorists have taken on one emotion replaces another emotion. If I help you activate anger to change shame, you don't walk around feeling angry. You walk around as a newly developed self-organization that has a different experiential state. So we get one emotion changes another emotion. We start thinking about sadness can change fear, anger can change shame, love changes hate, and so on and so forth. And it's not only that positive changes negative, which is more intuitively believed, but there is research from Barbara Fredrickson in positive psychology that you can undo negative emotions with positive emotions. But I'm going to prefer, given the time, to not talk about that, but that is there in the literature, that people have been shown that they can change negative states, which are measured by galvanic skin response and heart rate, by generating positive emotions. You think of or imagine a memory of being with a loved one, and that helps to change fear or disgust, right? But then we have reconsolidation memory, where you can update memories with new information after the memory has been activated for about 10 minutes. Now, it's very interesting, because when I first read the paper, I thought it was within the first 10 minutes. But they discovered by some serendipitous process with rats, right, that it's actually after you've activated the first memory, it's 10 minutes after that that the reconsolidation of the memory starts happening. So you have to introduce the new memory, the new experience, about 10 minutes after. And then it started making sense of what we do in therapy. Because you don't just say, oh, I felt like a little girl in a dungeon and it was awful. You spend 10 minutes. You spend time processing that productively to actually get to a new emotion, and then the new emotion comes up and transforms it, right? And also, I would say to people in supervising them, it's no good getting the fear this session and next session getting the anger. It's more than 6 hours away. It's too far away. So the whole implication is we need to work with activating the painful emotional memories, process these, and then within the context of that, but not immediately, begin to create new experience. So the basic reconsolidation hypothesis, which has some empirical evidence, is there's an event, we encode it, we consolidate that, and it becomes a fixed memory. And this is the old view of memory, or the basic received view, right? And then the notion was the memory is reactivated, I remember it, and it goes back into memory after I've reactivated it, and it's the fixed memory. So it's stable, it doesn't change. But it's been found that what actually happens is when you reactivate the memory, it becomes unfixed. This is the labile memory. The memory becomes labile and open to new input. So if we offer new altered experience, if the person within 10 minutes after the memory activation, they begin to have a new altered experience, there's a high probability that they will take this new information and it will become the memory will become reconsolidated, taking in or assimilating this new altered experience, and you'll get a transformed memory.
Okay, so thank you very much Les, I was very much impressed by your presentation. So now it's my turn maybe to ask a few questions, if you agree. So first, maybe I was also very much impressed by how you use important theoretical models on emotion and apply them for clinical settings. And of course, the topic of changing emotions is also sometimes looked at outside of the clinical world. But to the best of my knowledge, it's not typically investigated with the idea that new emotions will change emotions. But very often it's from another framework, and maybe we can talk about it in 1 minute. But I wanted to say how much personally I like the idea that emotions themselves can change the emotion system, because there is too often, I think, this idea that emotion would be this crazy horse, and you need to have the rational rider who regulates, emotion, and you would need to have something outside the emotion system that would regulate emotion. And so I just wanted to hear what you think of this new trend, I would say, on emotion regulation research, where people are even trained to regulate their own emotion, but most of the time, not by using other emotions, but by using some cognitive mechanisms or other mechanisms.
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly I disagree with it or see it. Yeah, I mean, that's become to dominate the therapeutic field, and then also even with James Gross and emotion regulation. And I've had discussions with him. This applies the same as what I was saying about extinction. I think firstly, they are talking about regulating symptomatic emotions, and the goal is to promote coping. So, I mean, there is a need when somebody is, I like to say colloquially, freaking out, right? But if they're highly anxious, highly dysregulated, if they're going to cut themselves and so on, to have ways of down-regulating, right? But this is a coping skill, it's not a transformation. This person is highly anxious, freaking out, cutting themselves, because underneath this symptomatic distress is some core emotion schematic memory system that's being activated, like I'm all alone and I'm desperate and nobody will ever be there for me. But that's not what's being down-regulated. That's not what is there being dealt with. So the issue is emotion regulation in the clinical context is generally about dysfunctional secondary responses, not about the primary. So we I mean, you do need to help people sometimes when they're panicking intensely. You have to help learn some skills. I mean, I'm not a fan of learning skills, but you can help people to breathe and to down-regulate and so on. But that's not where the focus is, and I think the current field has created such a focus on that to the detriment of working with transformation. They just work with coping, which is like a Band-Aid skill.
Do you think that there is an exception with the notion of reappraisal? Because of reappraisal? Because in a way, reappraisal is using appraisal mechanisms that are part of emotion. So somehow you use some of the components of emotion to change emotions, and it's a typical emotion regulation strategy that is used.
Yes. You see, I think the problem in psychology research is talking about emotion as it functions in the normal world in the average person versus emotion in psychopathology, in distress. So of course, I mean, if I reappraise that you are drinking your water because you're thirsty, excuse me, rather than that you're bored, that's good. But the problem is, if I've got a very strong shame-based activation, how are you going to get me to reappraise? So it's the product, not the process of change. I mean, we reappraise when we've changed, but the issue is, how do you get reappraisal in a clinical situation? That's like, I can't get you to reappraise that it's not shaming, because you feel it's shaming. You know, people even, you know, the standard criticism in cognitive therapy, I know it's not true, but I still feel it.